This is the Alpha Human Podcast, and I am your host, Lawrence Rosenberg. Today's guest is Sean McFate. Sean is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a Washington, D.C. think tank, and a professor of strategy at the National Defense University and Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Sean served as a paratrooper and officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division under Generals Stan McChrystal and David Petraeus, and was a private military contractor and paramilitary where he raised armies for U.S. interests abroad. Sean is also the author of the nonfiction book, The New Rules of War: How America Can Win Against Russia, China, and Other Threats. The New Rules of War was actually named a book of the year by The Economist. Sean also authored the book, The Modern Mercenary: Private Armies and What They Mean for World Order, which we'll talk a lot about in this podcast. And Sean also writes military thrillers. His latest novel is High Treason, which had the #1 New York Times bestselling author James Patterson saying, Sean McFate just might be the next Tom Clancy. Only I think he's even better. The action is nonstop. Wow. Sean, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Lawrence. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Man, you're drawing comparisons to Tom Clancy and another famous name that's linked with military, or certainly military strategy. Admiral Jim Stavridis, if I'm saying his name correctly, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, said, Sean McFate is a new Sun Tzu. These are some heavy-duty comparisons, Sean.
I'm humbled. I am truly humbled by both of them. And nobody was more surprised than I, but thank you very much.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've read your books, not the novels, although I'm highly intrigued by the novels. High Treason looks really exciting. But I've read The Modern Mercenary, which is just, it really is an eye-opener for anyone who doesn't understand where things stand with the modern military, let alone how mercenaries and private military contractors are such a part of what the modern military is today, but also The New Rules of War, which I'm not finished with yet, but which is a mind blower, really, even for people that are up to date on current events, on military actions, on geopolitics. It really is an eye opener. So we'll get into all of it, a lot more on the Modern Mercenary. But I'd love to start with really kind of what inspired you. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background on what motivated you to join the military in the first place, and the Army in particular. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I was not one of those kids who played soldier growing up. I was like the least stereotypical kid in the world. I would read encyclopedias on Saturday afternoons. I was very geeky. Yeah, I was very not into G.I. Joe, any of that stuff. What happened is, I was a small kid. My grandfather, like many of our grandfathers, fought in World War II.
Okay.
And he was in the Battle of the Bulge and was shot and left for dead by both the Americans and the Germans. And his mother got the telegram. And 3 days later, he was fished out of the snow by some Belgian nuns or something. He never talked about the war, like many people in that generation, never talked about it. But he always told me as a child, was it like 4 or 5, Sean, no matter what you do, you will serve in the military. You will serve your country. And, go to college and then serve your country and then do whatever you want. And that really stuck with me. And so my goal in college was to actually become a professor of philosophy. I really wanted to go to be, my dream was not to be a soldier. My dream was to be a liberal arts professor at a New England, liberal arts school with elbow patches and a pipe. That was it for me.
Okay.
But I felt my grandfather's voice. He had, at that point, and I thought, I thought it'd be kind of fraudulent if I was going to become a professor of moral philosophy and all I had known is the ivory tower. So I thought, why not? And what happened was even more surprising is that I found out I enjoyed it and I was good at it. I was this nerdy, geeky kid in high school turned into like this paratrooper. And so I stuck around.
Yeah. And you talk about going from, as you describe it, a geeky kid, a bookworm, wanting to become a professor, and then you become a paratrooper. Yeah. 82nd Airborne, you're jumping out of planes. And by the way, it's not just that, because from there, you go even to the next level, right? So you at some point, you do leave the military and you become a private military contractor. But what I noticed the term paramilitary. So whether you can say or not, did you work paramilitary as contracted out to the CIA at any point? Or
I can't say obviously, but I did work for the U.S. government doing things that traditionally would have been CIA missions or Special Operations Forces missions, and so you can draw your conclusions.
Yes, fair enough. But really, that making the first leap that you did, is powerful. But then that next step, you're dealing with, as a, reading your book as a PMC, you're out there, you're dealing with African warlords, right? You also were intimately involved in helping to stop an impending genocide in Rwanda. You're doing executive bodyguarding or security for the president, I think, of Burundi. You're getting into some really heady, dangerous G.I. Joe stuff.
Right.
So how did you make that transition?
Well, it's a great question. So I was in the Army in the 1990s, and the U.S. Army was, in my opinion, a terrible place to be because it didn't have a mission. It was in between the Cold War ending and 9/11. Okay. And it was like in search of itself. And I was a warrior in search of wars. And that's kind of what warriors do. And for good or for bad, that's a different discussion. But I was a warrior in search of wars. And I thought the future of U.S. military service would be peacekeeping, like Bosnia. And so I wanted to find where are the conflicts today. And that's kind of what propelled me to leave the military. And I became a private military contractor in Africa. Africa is the continent that has the most conflict. It's not the Middle East or South Asia. That's like Cub Scouts compared to Africa. We just don't cover it in American media. Okay. And so I found myself in Africa doing these crazy things, initially for the U.S. government, and then for some other clients who had, shall we say, sanctioned by the U.S. government. Right. But they weren't the U.S. government. But I found myself doing things there that would have traditionally have been done by what we think of as CIA or Special Operations Forces. And it made me think, what does it mean that we're outsourcing our foreign policy? And what does it mean long term? Because most of the people I talked to who are policymakers were only thinking about it in very short-term ways. And that disturbed me, as well as another epiphany that I looked around at some point in my career in Africa and realized there are no old people in my business. So between these two things, I was questioning my life choices.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I've spoken to some PMCs, some, if you want to call them mercenaries, soldiers of fortune. Dale Comstock, who's a very well-known private military contractor. Yeah, he's about the oldest mercenary you'll find,
Yeah.
who maybe is, was even working up until perhaps last year.
Yeah.
So, but it's a rare thing, as you said, to find, anyone doing that kind of dangerous work as a career.
It's rare. Yeah, it's rare.
So like a moth to a flame, like a lot of these guys, I mean, I talked to a lot of special operators who actually were in the military, in the Army, in the Special Forces, in the Rangers around the time you were in the 82nd Airborne. And they all say the same thing, it was in between, right? The Cold War ending and Iraq.
Right.
The second time we went into Iraq. And so in that middle ground, we probably only had Grenada and Panama. And that's about it, right?
Yeah. Nothing really.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess a lot of guys like yourselves found work with the Dying Corps of the world. You worked for Dying Corps, is that right?
Initially, I worked for Dying Corps, then I became independent after that. Yeah.
Okay. So for it's funny because I think you mentioned how your buddies from the 82nd Airborne kind of frowned on the fact that you went that route. They said that you had gone mercenary.
I had gone merc, yeah, gone to the dark side. Exactly. I'd fallen from grace.
You've fallen from grace. You went to the dark side. So let's explain for the audience, those who might not be aware.
Yeah.
What are PMCs, or private military contractors? You also refer to them as, and again, I might get the nuances wrong, so please correct me, but expeditionary conflict entrepreneurs or military enterprisers.
Right. So just in general, for anybody who's not really familiar, there have been volumes of ink spilled in academic literature and like think tank white papers, you name it, on the differences between private military contractors, mercenaries, all these other things. And it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. If you can be one, you can be the other. So basically, what a private military contractor is, or a mercenary, is these are armed civilians who fight in foreign wars primarily for profit, right? And now whether they are Blackwater or they are Wagner Group, which, it really makes no difference. The label is just a euphemism. If we are honest with ourselves, there's no difference. There's no bright line between the two. And we can explore why that's the case. But what you think of a mercenary, that's what a mercenary is. But there's a lot of also misperceptions currently about what mercenaries are. I mean, it's the second oldest profession for a reason. And so part of why I wrote The Modern Mercenary was to sort of lay all this bare, not just from it's not a tell-it-all memoir. I mean, I could have written that. It's a deep dive intellectually into the history of private military force and how that changes international relations as we know it. But it starts with this question of who and what is a mercenary?
So I still, and if you do read your book, which I recommend to everybody who's interested in this topic, and it is an incredibly compelling topic because it isn't just about the concept of the mercenary or a soldier for hire. It's interwoven with foreign policy.
Yeah.
It's interwoven with economics. It sits at this weird core of the past, the present, and the future, and spans, like I said, geopolitics through to economic theory. But if you read your book, though, you will see these subtle nuances between the two. So let me ask you then. Let's use the comparison or the types of companies you just mentioned. So what's the difference between the triple canopies and the Dying Corps of the world?
Yeah.
And traditional mercenary firms like the now defunct Executive Outcomes, which I believe originally was a South African concern.
Yes.
That also, if my memory is correct, operated in Africa, but in
Mm-hmm.
the 60s.
Right. So executive outcomes actually was in the 1990s after
Oh,
apartheid South Africa fell.
sorry.
But no, it's it's an amazing story, and I don't mean amazing in a morally good way.
Right.
It's an amazing story. Uh, Executive outcomes is still, in my opinion, the epitome of the modern mercenary corporation. It's a private army with a private air force, and they're out of business now. They sort of went defunct in 1998,
Okay.
but they have an alumni network of operators throughout Africa. And so when I was in Africa in the early 2000s and mid 2000s, I ran into a lot of these guys, and were all guys, and they were very good at their job, very good. And they're still out there. In 2015, Nigeria hired remnants of them to take care of Boko Haram, which they did, which we can talk about.
Okay.
We're seeing them in Mozambique and other places like that too. But executive outcomes is what we think of as the traditional mercenary organization, right? It's similar to like the White Star Company of the Middle Ages in Italy. It's like this, it's a private army. It's a turnkey solution, right? And you hire them to wage war. Blackwater and Triple Canopy and others are a little different in that they themselves are not able to be a fully autonomous private army. They are more like auxiliaries to an army, right? They support the U.S. Army, or in this case, what they really were in Iraq was security details for high value people. They really weren't a paramilitary force. They had guys who could have done that. They had like ex-SEALs and ex-Delta Force and ex-Rangers, but that's not really what their job was. And in many ways, they were not autonomous. They were really dependent on their client, the US government. So you can make an argument that the difference between a full-on mercenary is like they're autonomous turnkey warriors versus a Blackwater, which they are, in more of a supporting role. But I think you can look beyond that and say that was the nature of the contract they had. Blackwater had they had a different contract, been more of a private military. And here's an example. And I was called in 2008. There was the raging genocide in Darfur. Maybe some of your listeners will recall this. And the UN reaction was anemic. The US had declared it a genocide, and under international law had to do something about that, but they didn't do anything about it. And so a lot of private actors thought about, can we hire a private military company to go into Darfur and create sort of islands of humanity to keep the Janjaweed out. They were killing people. Okay. And Blackwater had this subunit called Greystone that could do it, and they really could do it. So they just didn't have the contract to do it. So really the difference between a mercenary and a private military company is mostly semantic. Gotcha. It's mostly based on political top cover and the nature of the contract they have, but you're basically asking the same labor pool. You're tapping the same labor pool. So that's why I say earlier that if you could do one, you can do the other. But there, obviously executive outcomes, as you mentioned, in our lifetime remains like the mercenary corporation.
Got you. Thanks for clarifying that. And I was thinking late 60s, early 70s, and I think maybe because of films like The Wild Geese.
Sure.
Right? You had these guys.
You had a lot of guys out there. Well, all those wars of decolonization, especially in Africa, especially the Belgian Congo, attracted all sorts of mercenaries. Mike Hoare and some others. And the film Wild Geese is it's a fairly accurate movie for its era. So, but the difference between then and now is that mercenaries back in the 50s and 60s and 70s were kind of like have gun, will travel, right? Have AK-47. Now they're much more organized and they're tapped into the international financial system, and they're much more sophisticated and a lot more lethal. And this is why it should concern us all.
Interesting. So we'll get back to why it should concern us in a moment, but it's very ominous. So superpowers such as the United States, as you mentioned in the book, cannot go to war
Yeah.
without contractors, without PMCs in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, which was not the case 20 years ago.
No.
What changed? What happened?
There's a lot of, well, it's an easy question with a complicated answer. So if you think about it, when the U.S. went to war in World War II, only 10% of the force was contracted.
Okay.
By the Iraq War, it was 50% of the force were contracted.
Wow.
In Afghanistan, it was 75% of the force.
75%.
75%. To this day, we have about two or three times more contractors on the ground in Afghanistan than we do troops.
Wow.
Now, just to be clear, most of those contractors are not what we consider to be mercenaries or private military contractors. They are not trigger pullers. They're not training people to pull triggers. Mm-hmm. They're like cooks and mechanics and, doing innocuous jobs. Okay. So just to be clear, but it is true though, that the U.S. cannot wage war without the private sector. And I don't mean just, the military industrial complex used to be about building products like jet fighters, right? And bombers. Now it's also about services, including lethal services. Our country is actually strategically dependent on the private sector to sustain wars. We can start a war, but sustaining it is hard. And most of those contractors aren't even American, right? We live in a global economy. When I was in the industry, only the senior leadership and top middle management were Americans like me. Most of the rank and file were from Mexico, New Zealand, Ghana, you name it, right? And so this industry is truly globalized, just like the t-shirt industry is globalized. There's, the face of it is American, but everything else is everything else.
Wow. So you suggest that the industry is beginning to bifurcate between a mediated market with military enterprises, enterprisers, and a free market populated by mercenaries, and you say whichever trajectory wins the market in the coming years between the enterprisers and the mercenaries, that the outcome will be of critical importance because it will influence the future of war.
That's right.
How so?
So when we think of like Blackwater, and this is maybe an earlier question, in some ways I said they played a more supporting role to the government, to the US government, versus Executive Outcomes, which was an autonomous private military. That's the difference between a mercenary and we call military enterpriser. A military enterpriser is a term that goes back to the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, which was fought between, at that point, the superpowers of Europe, which was like Germany and, believe it or not, Sweden, right? Sweden, before they made furniture, they were a feared superpower in Central Europe.
No one would believe it.
No one would believe it, right? No one would believe it. That war, the 30 Years' War, was fought by a lot of mercenaries, but they were more like Blackwater today. They were not necessarily, at the beginning of the war at least, they were not autonomous. You had these like billionaire mercenary organizers like Wallenstein, who basically created rental regiments to the kings and the princes of his day. And those regiments served under a flag, but were themselves mercenary. That's kind of what Blackwater was like.
Okay.
And over time, they became autonomous mercenaries, and they did a lot of harm in Europe. They did a lot of harm in Europe. And so we're seeing a repeat of that in the last 10 years, but it's going in a different direction. So companies like Blackwater and DynCorp and a lot of others have created a lot of imitators around the world.
Okay.
From like Russia's Wagner Group to a lot of these other companies. And also we're seeing the industry atomize. Rather than, back 15, 20 years ago, you had DynCorp, which was traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
You have companies like Aegis, is traded on the London Stock Exchange. They had big clients like the UK government and US government, and now they don't have those clients anymore, and they've broken up. And the companies themselves don't really exist, but their personnel do. And a lot of them, not all of them, have formed their own small mercenary groups. And they're seeking new clientele in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in in Somalia, you name it. And that is the world we're facing, because when the US government was sort of like, 15 years ago, when you think of Blackwater, that's like Jurassic that's old history now.
Okay.
At that point, the US government we were called a monospony. The US government was like the sugar daddy, the main client. And as such, it had market power to sort of set conditions like, you'll behave this way, you will not behave this way. And if that happens, we will not renew your contract. Now, the US government did a pretty poor job of creating the rules of the road, but they had some influence. Now that the US government has left Iraq, has left Afghanistan, has canceled almost all those contracts, it's a free-for-all. And now we're having a free market for force, which is what the world was like before the 30 Years' War. That's how in the Middle Ages, that's how wars were fought, through mercenaries. Popes had armies, huge mercenary armies. It was just normal, right? Where in fact, the word for mercenary in like Middle Ages Italian, Middle Ages Europe is condottieri, which means contractor, just like we call them today, right? And so we are regressing back to that world, and we don't know it. We've forgotten what it looks like, because the world that we grew up with in 6th grade learning about is that only nation states, govern international relations. And they did it through the monopoly of force with their national armies. But now that nation states are losing the monopoly of force, that there's private force once more in international relations, it will change who has power in international relations and why. And now it'll be the super rich can become superpowers if they can swipe a check to do so.
Wow, that's very sobering. So, and just to clarify, for the audience, what is, when you talk about the difference between a mediated market and a free market, what is a mediated market?
Yeah, so a mediated market is a market with like laws and rules and regulation, right? So, think about, automobiles, right? In our country, there are certain codes of safety, et cetera, et cetera. A free market is a purely laissez-faire market where anything goes. It's the invisible hand of the marketplace, as Adam Smith would call it. And that is very compelling when we're talking about warfare, right? Suddenly, and what that really means is that mercenary, you have an industry invested in conflict, which will go to the most conflict-prone continents in the world. And they will, because of profit motive, will start and elongate wars for profit, which is a pretty, as you say, sobering thought. And we're seeing that right now.
Yeah, you suggest, in fact, that a new type, because of this, this bifurcation and the trends of where things are going.
Yeah.
You suggest that a new type of warfare may emerge, what you call contract warfare.
Right.
One that encourages war.
That's right.
So what is contract warfare?
Well, so contract warfare is like contract killing on a much bigger scale, right? So think of yourself as Tony Soprano or Don Corleone. You want something done. You can hire a contract killer in the mafia to do it. It's the same way, but now you can like wipe out whole regions and countries, right? And populations. Mm-hmm. And so we're seeing this. So when I wrote Modern Mercenary, which was, 6-7 years ago, at that point, the US still had a lot of contracts in Afghanistan. And I said, hey, look, the future is going to be one of two directions. The market's bifurcating. It's going to become more like private enterprisers. We're going to have like a quasi-legitimate private military company model serving just countries like the United States, or maybe the UN would use them for peacekeeping, or they're going to go full on like mercenary, traditional mercenary, which is that they're going to go into the shadows and offer lethality to the highest bidder. Exactly what the stereotype suggests. And in the last 7 years, that's exactly what has occurred. There is a small wing of, shall we say, private military companies. They're kind of represented by this organization in Switzerland called the International Code of Conduct Association,
Okay.
ICOCA, but they are dying, and we can talk about why they're dying. It's a noble effort, but frankly, they're struggling to keep afloat. Meanwhile, the straight up mercenary world has been growing. We've seen mercenaries operate in Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, again, Nigeria, Somalia, the Congo, rumors in Venezuela. I mean, we know that in Venezuela. I mean, all sorts of places. And they are operating in the shadows, and they don't work just for countries. So we have reports of ex-Navy SEALs, ex-Green Berets, working as hit squads in Yemen for Middle Eastern monarchies, right? That's what we've come to. It looks very medieval all of a sudden. We never thought that we'd have ex-Green Berets doing this. And it's not just one or two, it's more than one or two. But that's our new world.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I'm going to bring that up in a moment because that is it's a perfect example of what you've been predicting.
Yeah.
So I want to touch on something you mentioned about contract warfare, which is contract warfare can encourage war. In the book, you use the film Yojimbo as an analogy for what that means. For most Americans, they're probably more familiar with the American version of the film, the Clint Eastwood movie, A Fistful of Dollars, right?
Right, exactly.
So if anyone's seen the film A Fistful of Dollars, or if you've seen Yojimbo, can you talk about how the contract warrior, or the contract warfare can encourage wars?
So in the movie Yojimbo, it's a great Japanese movie from the late 50s maybe.
Yep.
And it's about this samurai who's like what do you call a masterless Ronin? He's a Ronin.
Yeah.
And he shows up and there's like a small town, and there's these two warlords, and they're trying to kill each other essentially, and they're ripping the town apart. And basically through cunning, he plays each one off of each other, saying he's working for one now, he kills a few, working for another, then he kills a few. Before it's all done, he ends up killing them all by playing them off against each other through cunningness. And then he moves on to the next town. This is a classic example about the marketization of warfare, right? And we've seen a lot of this in the Middle Ages, when mercenaries were how you fought wars. If you think of Niccolo Machiavelli's book, The Prince, he rants on and on against mercenaries being perfidious, unfaithful. And part of my research for this book and for the New Rules of War was actually, hard duty, but in Florence, going through Machiavelli's archives about the Italian wars of his period, because mercenaries would play clients against each other. They would manipulate information. They would do all sorts of nasty things to shake down. And here's why, to your bigger question, this is how it changes warfare. When you introduce private sector warriors, it's suddenly military strategy blends with market strategy. It's like Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. It's like the rules of the souk or marketplace are bizarre, now apply in war strategy. And our 4-stars have no clue about how that type of war is fought, even though most of history, biblical, Julius Caesar, Machiavelli, that's how wars were fought. And here's some examples of strategies in the marketplace that work in war. Just say that we wanted to really invade Canada, right? We're tired of Canada. They should be the 51st state. They should have gotten that memo 250 years ago, right? But we live in a world where nobody can afford a standing army. So what we're going to do is we're going to hire a bunch of mercenaries in secret to build up our mercenary army to invade Canada. But we're also going to retain every mercenary unit in North America. Why would we do that? So when they figure out that we're about to invade them, there's no more units on the marketplace to get, right? We've sucked up the entire marketplace. Even if we're not using them, we're paying them to sit on their butts. That's a market strategy. And also, but we find out on game day, when we go invade, Canada through Minnesota, that half of our mercenaries defect and turn against us. And Canada secretly bribed half of our mercenaries against us. It's another market strategy. And these are the types of wars that Machiavelli was fighting in 1506 and 50. And that's why he's saying this is ridiculous. And so we've gotten away from that. But that's how wars used to work. It was a blend of military strategy and economic strategy. I'm a professor at a war college. We only train military strategy. We have no economics in our curriculum, which is bonkers for a lot of reasons. But war is becoming increasingly marketized, and those who know it can exploit it, and those who don't will be exploited.
Yeah, this is this is what kind of leads into the new your new rules of war, which we'll touch on. So you mentioned Venezuela.
Yeah.
So and I wanted to really talk to you about this case for a moment, because for anyone who doesn't know, Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido, and he's the opposition leader, but I think the current administration in Washington recognizes Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, not Maduro.
Right.
But you had Guaido and his strategy committee. They apparently contracted an American company, Silver Corps, headed up by, as you mentioned, a former Green Beret.
Yeah.
And the contract was to capture Maduro and expel him from the country. And they went forward with a raid that they had about 60 Venezuelan dissidents and a few ex-Army Special Forces, right? A few ex-Green Berets. Right. Mm-hmm. So the plan fails. A bunch of guys get killed. The Green Berets, except for Gaudreau, who runs Silver Corps, but the two of the Green Berets on the mission itself get captured. And here's what I wanted to kind of delve into. So apparently, the general strategist from Guaido's committee, who did the contracting, mm-hmm. told the Washington Post that they had been in contact with a number of PMCs about mm-hmm. ousting Maduro, and the prices that were being demanded were from $500 million to $1.5 billion.
Yeah.
Now, and the reason they went with Gaudreau and Silver Corps is because he came up with like a self-financed plan where, it would be based on future oil sales and you get a couple $100 million. So, I mean, are those the kind of figures that we're talking about? Because, I mean, if they would have paid the $500 million, or even, I mean, if they would have hired maybe one of the more well-known PMCs, right? The big boys. And if they would have paid $1 billion to get the job done, I mean, we're talking about serious money here.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, so has that opened the door to essentially taking out the leaders of countries? I mean, I can't, Venezuela and the communist regime there and what they've done to the country, he deserves to be ousted. But I mean, essentially we're talking about underwriting for a fee, the removal of our enemy's leaders, right?
Well, not only that, the U.S. has bounties on people like Maduro. We have a $15 million bounty on him and $50 million for some of his henchmen. That's going to attract mercenaries. So we're propagating this, right? But the $1.5 billion price tag, who knows? I mean, The oldest problem in the mercenary business is getting paid. So when I was in Africa,
Okay.
A minister from a country came to me. They a failed state. I was working in West Africa, and they had a lot of Chinese fishing vessels poaching their fish, their fish stocks, if you will, off of their coast in the Atlantic, and they wanted it to stop.
Okay.
And they came to me and said, can you make us a small littoral private navy? And I said I could.
Okay.
And we worked it out. We looked at money, but we didn't know how they would pay us. Okay. And the history of mercenaries and the masters is both ripping each other off. Both. Now, because there's no court of law you can go to, right? Who are you going to go to sue? So a common workaround, whether it be in medieval England, where Henry II used mercenaries to put down a huge rebellion of aristocrats, or you look at Wagner Group in Syria, or you look at Venezuela. What they do sometimes is they say, "Hey, look, let's go into business for each other, with each other." It's like intermarriage. It's like two warring families marrying their son and daughter together, and they say, "Okay, so we have an asset, an oil mine, an oil drill field. Okay. If you secure that, I will do a revenue share with you." And that's how they keep each other honest. And that's what Wagner Group did in Syria. Said, we want you to clear these these natural gas fields of ISIS, and we'll give you. And so Wagner Group did that for a Russian oil company. We've done this before. So this is a method of payment that's quite old, of going into business with each other.
Yeah, that is, it's fascinating because you can see how these things must have played out throughout history. Sure. Where, the ruler of the country who wins the war defaults on the contract, doesn't pay. And then what happens? Then they go to war with the,
right.
with the ruler of the country. And you're right. So it's diabolical. What can happen here? And it's most people do not realize what the future holds, because the whole world can tip into this kind of future very quickly. Right. For instance, and you mentioned this as well, so I'll use this as an example. You have, initially in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan, in the war on terror, right? You had the modern private military contractor, and their activity, as you said, was kind of limited to carrying out security.
Right.
But just in the last decade, that's changed dramatically. For instance, you mentioned having American special operators working for American companies that are being hired by Middle East monarchs. Let's just say, hired by the UAE, hired by Saudi Arabia. They're contracting American PMCs that use ex-special operators to kill high-value targets in Yemen. Right. In fact, in the case I'm referring to, and that you were probably referring to, there's a company called Spear Operations Group out of Pittsburgh, right, that they hired. And again, perhaps this is in our interests, right? UAE is our ally, Saudi Arabia is our ally, and what's going on in Yemen, the taking out of those high value targets. Is potentially very well in our interests, but we can't send in, right? We can't send in Delta Force over there, right? We can't do it because there would be hell to pay politically if we're going in there with a kill list, right? Assassinating high value targets, right? If it got out, I guess. But in this case, so what is the? And this isn't. I'm not casting a moral judgment here. I'm just curious. So, is it legal for an American company to work for a foreign government and essentially assassinate high-value targets.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that's illegal.
So how?
Sorry, taking a stab at that. But I'll tell you that, look, the reason why mercenaries are coming back, not just, I mean, look, who hires mercenaries? A lot of them are rich countries like UAE who want to go to war but don't really have a military to do it.
Right.
Right. So Saudi Arabia talks to UAE. It says, look, we're going to war in Yemen, contribute. And so they hire people to do it for them. You're also seeing the extractive industry and really, billionaires starting to hire them more and more to do whatever they want, which is a whole different conversation. But the question is, why are countries like Russia and United States, which have powerful militaries, why are they hiring private military contractors? I mean, surely we have SEAL Team 6 and Delta. Why do we need them?
Right.
The reason why, and I flagged this early in the Modern Mercenary and take it up in the New Rules of War, the reason why literally the mercenary world is booming is because they give you the most precious asset in modern war, and that's plausible deniability. Okay? It's plausible. So we live in an information age.
Yes.
And weapons that give you plausible deniability are now more important than raw firepower. Look at how Russia took the Ukraine in 2014. I mean, in the old rules of war, when Russia wanted to put their boot on somebody's neck, they rolled in the tanks, like in Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia 68. It was pure force, and that worked. That doesn't work anymore. In fact, pure force is a liability in modern warfare. What you want to do is you want to wage war in the shadows, and so nobody ever sees it. So by the time anybody sees it, it's a fait accompli, which is what they did with Crimea. They created the fog. Russia created the fog of war in Ukraine using a ghost occupation army of Wagner Group mercenaries, Spetsnaz special forces, little green men, these astroturfed separatist Russian units, militia, and a lot of active measures and dense propaganda. Right? They manipulated our perception of reality so that when Western leaders were still scratching their head about what exactly was going on in Eastern Ukraine, we saw tanks in Crimea, and those tanks arrived that day. Crimea was already occupied by this ghost occupation force. And that's what modern war is. Look at Syria. Do we know who's on the ground and why? Look at Libya. We have mercenaries battling mercenaries. These are the conflicts of the future in the way that the Spanish Civil War presaged World War II, right? Warfare is changing. It's going underground into the shadows. And one of the most important instruments of modern war are mercenaries, because they can do things that we don't want our own soldiers caught doing on CNN and Fox News. And if it really gets bad, we'll say, we don't know who they are. And you say, well, that's ridiculous. Say, Sean, that's ridiculous. We know those Spetsnaz guys, what they were doing in Ukraine and Wagner Group. We know what Wagner Group's doing in Libya, but we don't react the same way, right? I mean, that's the difference. So it gives plausible deniability, not just for the country using them, but for the country who's a victim who really doesn't really want to escalate to war as well. All sides can back down and sort of scratch it up to a bunch of rogue, war tourists, as Churchill would say.
Yeah, you mentioned this in the book. This idea of plausible deniability.
Yeah.
And why that's so powerful. And I've read both of your books, most of New Rules of War. And so I kind of crisscross between the two, but this type of fighting in the shadows, so to speak, is perhaps a return to the past, and we'll get into what that really means. I'm going to use one of your terms in a moment that's fascinating, but I wanted to ask you, I'm going to quote you from the book. You said, today, military action is the sole purview of nation states and the United Nations. only states are allowed to wage war. And corporations, human rights groups, rich people, and all other non-state actors are forbidden to use military force to achieve their objectives. But as we were just discussing, you're starting to see instances where that's not the case.
Right.
So do you see this changing? Is there a future not too distant where we have corporations, billionaires, fighting their own private wars with private militaries?
The answer is yes. I mean, look, if you look at world history, most of military history is privatized. It's this strange period of time, sometime between the 18th century and 1945 or 2000, where only nation states were the only actors who could use armed force for armed politics, right? Before that, war is just armed politics. And we don't, we are taught that only nations can do that, but that's not what most of history is. We are just returning back to the status quo ante. We're going back to normal. That's what we don't understand, is that most of world history, war is a lot more diffuse in its actors and its reasons, and it can become very petty and very harmful. We are returning to that. And if you look at it, I mean, the Fortune 500 are more powerful than most states in the world right now. When we think of nation states, people always think of the top 30. Nobody thinks about the bottom 160, right? I mean, if ExxonMobil goes in the Gulf of Guinea, are you really going to tell me that the Gabon is more powerful than ExxonMobil because it's a state? Absolutely not. And ExxonMobil, they play power politics. They hire, we even talked about, there's a whole private intelligence world out there too, like private CIAs that fuse fairly well with the private military world, and they work for private sector. And you look at things like south of our border in Mexico, you have narco wars there.
Yes.
That's the future of war. Now, strangely enough, the US government doesn't view it as war at all, even though people on the ground certainly do. They view it as criminality. And it's strange to look at, what do we privilege as war than criminality, even though more people died in narco wars last year than Iraq or Afghanistan. Wow. Somehow we privilege Iraq and Afghanistan as wars, but Mexico, it's just criminality. The Rwanda genocide, criminality. An 800,000 person homicide, so what, right? So we have, but what we're seeing in the Latin American instance is that you have narco groups who are waging wars against each other. And states are not drivers of war. States are booty to be won in those wars. And we call them narco states, like Salvador and Guatemala, and some would say Mexico. That is going to look more like the future of war. I'm not saying the United States of America or Western Europe or Eastern Asia is going to look like that. Right. But the Middle East is already that way. Sub-Saharan Africa is largely that way. Parts of South Asia are already that way. We are simply going back. The pendulum is swinging to the status quo ante before states ruled the roost, before states had the pride of place in international politics. And we're returning to a time when anybody, any family, any city, anybody who can afford the means of war, mercenaries, can wage it for whatever reason they want. And we're starting to see this unravel in a matter of 3 decades.
Wow. Okay. And as you say, this has been a feature of warfare for, at least 3,000 years. Yeah. So no surprise that, this small period of time where wars were fought conventionally with standing armies is disappearing. We'll talk about that. But I want to quote you again from the book. You said by the 1600s, or the 17th century, the conduct of violence was a capitalist enterprise no different from any other industry. And war became the biggest industry in Europe. And you already mentioned Wallenstein
Yes.
Right, who offered his services to the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, I believe, in right the 30 Years' War,
Yep.
and ended up becoming the richest man in Europe.
He was.
Okay, so do you foresee a free market for force minting a new crop of billionaires and becoming one of the globe's largest industries once again?
It's a great question. And one has to be humble about predictions. I do see that we live in an insecure world that's growing more insecure every decade, so it seems to me, where those who can sell security can do well. Now, will there be a Jeff Bezos of this world? I don't know, not right now. Maybe by the end of the century, that will be the case, unless nation states reassert sort of a global hegemony together, which I think is, as likely as world peace. So I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, we still don't know what. I mean, I did a sabbatical at Oxford. I was a fellow at Oxford. I was researching the question of how did states take over international relations. It's completely anomalous in human history. The bottom line is nobody knows. There's no consensus amongst historians or experts. And I don't know how we'd replicate that, especially since we don't even know how it happened to begin with. So I do think it's inevitable that we'll start to see, Wallenstein's the future. Whether they become the richest man in the world, I don't know, but I think it's going to become a bigger industry than it is today.
Okay, and that's fair enough. But I want to kind of dig into this point that you just made, kind of how did this anomaly occur? Because so the state's monopoly on the conduct of violence, I think is a term you like to use,
sure,
is often traced back to the end of the 30 Years' War, right? And the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. You talk about this a lot in both books. And that period marked the end of the open market for force that had existed for thousands of years. So that I wanted to ask you, I mean, why did that war result in an end to the way wars had been conducted with the use of mercenary for thousands of years? What was it about that war, the peace treaties, because it spawned this anomalous period of the last, 400 years, 300 years?
That's right. Yeah. So we don't know is the short answer. We don't know. So throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, for example, mercenaries were how wars were fought. I mean, you had mercenaries were the main component. You had knights, right? But knights, they were small. They were kind of elite, but they were small. And you had like rabble. We had farmers given pitchforks and say, go to war. Right. And so mercenaries became the way, and also mercenaries and knights hated each other, just the way, private military contractors and say SEALs hate each other today, right? I mean, it's an ancient, interesting dichotomy of mutual disdain, which we can talk about. But the 30 Years' War, in some ways, it was much more horrific than World War II for Central Europe. Population percentage-wise, more people were killed in the 30 Years' War in Central Europe than during 1944 or 45. It took Central Europe a century to recover from it. And much of that damage was done by mercenaries, both in control and frankly out of control in business for themselves. Out of work mercenaries become marauders. This is the problem with mercenaries. They become bandits, preying off of the weak or demanding. They create their own demand curve by saying, hey, I heard you have, a bunch of pilgrims got massacred. You need to hire us to protect them, even though they themselves massacred the pilgrims. So you have all sorts of problems of governance. And I think there was it's one of those rare moments in history where there's a general exhaustion by both the people and the elites combined come 1648. Other things started to happen too. New technologies, governments were starting to professionalize and create civil service bureaucracies that had taxation. The Prussian state is an example of this, where it became, it used to be nobody wanted to invest in a standing army because it's A, too expensive, and B, you couldn't control it. They could be a coup machine. But as in the 17 and 1800s, as the imperial powers got more wealth, got larger, they created systems of bureaucracy, systems that can control and create the military. And from this era, you have people like Karl von Clausewitz and Jomini and other theorists. So much so that by the 1850s, I mean, mercenaries were used, like King George III used mercenaries in the American Revolutionary War. He doubled the size of the army by going to the German states and saying, I'm going to hire, what we're doing, he was hiring, German states militaries. They weren't like raw mercenaries, like the freebooters of old. They were like, I'm going to rent the 82nd Airborne Division for a year. And that's kind of how they did it. But so mercenaryism, the market for force, kind of dwindled gradually over time from being like independent contractors and independent armies to becoming sort of on the leash of states, to states renting their own militaries out to other states, to the 1850s outlawing all of it. So the Crimea Wars is the last time we see mercenaries used. They weren't even used in the war. Privateers were also outlawed in the 1850s. They're like mercenaries of the sea. And from the 1850s to like 1990, mercenaries are a thing of the past. They're driven completely underground. If they're used, in these African wars of decolonization, totally in the outskirts and the shadows. And then the Berlin Wall falls down and they start to reemerge. And that's where we are today. We've done this, a 360 at this point.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. You also talk about technology playing a role, accelerating the expansion or the proliferation of standing armies. How did technology advances like the advent of the gun?
Yeah.
How did that kind of proliferate the concept of standing armies versus mercenaries, you're out?
Yeah. So for most of medieval warfare, we're talking about Europe here, not, obviously Africa or South Asia or East Asia. I mean, there's lots of other parts of the world, but our military tradition comes from Europe, and international relations, for better or for worse, is built on a European model from the age of empire. Okay. And what mercenaries, one reason you'd hire mercenaries then, as you do today, is they bring niche units, specialty units. So they had these like heavy knights that take years of training to become a heavy knight, to do certain, and there's all sorts of different names for these knights. And if you really wanted to massacre your enemy, you needed some of these special units, but you couldn't afford them yourself. You had to sort of rent them, right? It's like a timeshare in some ways, right? Okay. And we see this today. So when Nigeria struggled against Boko Haram for 6 years, Nigeria finally said, screw it. I mean, Nigeria has a pretty strong military too. They hired mercenaries in 2015 in secret to wipe out Boko Haram. And these mercenaries showed up with attack helicopters, not just regular, but Mi-24 Hind helicopters. These are like Soviet flying tanks. Nothing, they're impossible to maintain unless you're like a specialty person. And they did. They wiped out. They search and destroy. They wiped them. They didn't wipe them out. They pushed them into their neighbor's backyard. A classic military strategy. But that's what happened. So, but now, bullets in like the 1800s, 1700s, now gunpowder was like the Stinger missile in, against these new, helicopters. I mean, like suddenly a relatively untrained peasant can fire a projectile that can punch a hole through an elite, infantry heavy armor unit. And firepower became the great leveler. And this opened up a new sort of, market for force. But at this point, governments were investing heavily in militaries. There weren't like military enterprises anymore. In fact, they were being outlawed and killed, literally. And that's the stigma of mercenaries today. It goes back to this time in the 1800s, 1700s, where like, if you're a mercenary, you're a threat to the state, we're taking you out, you're outlaws. Before then, it was never an outlaw. It was just seen as a bloody but honorable trade.
Wow. I mean, you could see how that one technological evolution could completely change the face of warfare by democratizing, right, the ability to wage war.
That's right.
But now we're getting back. But then war has become so specialized again that you back to, everything comes in cycles. I want to press on something we've kind of mentioned, but as just a fact of what's happening. But I want to see if I could shake loose what's fueling this move. Again, to quote you, you say, armies are an anomaly, right? Standing armies are an anomaly. The presence of a private military industry today is significant, and it indicates that the market for force is shifting back to a mediated market, and that the state's monopoly on force is loosening.
That's right.
And you say that if this trend continues, the world will return to a free market of mercenaries and contract warfare. So you're saying if the trend continues,
right?
What is fueling the trend? Right? What's fueling this trend?
So in some ways, Libya today is a case study in this.
Okay.
I mean, you have Turkey using mercenaries, you have the UAE using mercenaries, and Russia using mercenaries. And it's an example of what I call shadow war. We have all sorts of people there. We don't know who they fight for and why. Mm-hmm. And that's modern warfare. And most people don't even know what's going on in Libya, and that's by design. And that's because mercenaries, it's not just mercenaries, but a lot of mercenaries, they give you good plausible deniability. So the first thing that that's driving this trend is, if you want to wage war now, you have to do it away from the TV cameras, right? And so you need weapons that give you plausible deniabilities, and war is becoming more sneaky as a result, right? And mercenaries are the epitome of sneakiness. Another reason that you're seeing strong countries and rich countries only use mercenaries, right? Strong, like Russia and the US and the UAE, is because we have societies that are casualty averse. In other words, the American people do not like seeing dead Marines coming home in body bags from faraway places.
Right.
But we do not care two whits about a dead contractor at all.
It's true.
So if you are a politician and you want to wage war to look strong, but you don't want to have to deal with the blowback of dead Marines, send in the mercenaries or the private military contractors. This is my earlier point. It makes no difference what you call them. We know what they do, right? So if you want to, so for casualty adverse societies, and Russia has this as well. Russia has a lot of casualty averseness from the Afghan war from the 80s. Another reason you want to hire mercenaries is because, just say, you're a country like Nigeria that needs a specialty niche service that you can't afford, like specialty helicopters, which are very expensive to maintain and train. Of course, America, we don't have that problem. We're so rich. But a lot of nations they have to make choices. So it's better to rent them to own them. And so they're renting them. And you can rent special operations forces units as well. I mean, you could get almost anything. Well, you can get a lot in the market these days, and not everything. Also, if you're a smaller, sorry, go ahead, Lawrence.
No. I'm just.
The other reason you're seeing is that increasingly you're seeing non-state actors turning to this field, because America's heavy use of private military contractors in the Iraq and the Afghanistan war has kind of legitimized it to some extent. There was no international law blowback, nothing like that. And so now we can't finger wag at Russia for doing this with the Wagner Group, right? Or UAE or Turkey or anybody else. So we've normalized it to some extent. The sort of Pandora's box is open. And so we're also seeing that companies are using this, starting with the extractive industry like oil, gas, timber, because they don't have a choice where their asset is. They have to go to dangerous places because all the safe places are already mined out, tapped out. And they're starting to use private military companies now because they don't want to be at the mercy of corrupt local national forces. So we're seeing this this industry slowly emerge. It's not happening overnight. It's not like 9/11 where our life changes in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening over decades. We tend not to pay attention to it, but it's changing. When Mao says political power comes at the end of a gun. I'm not endorsing Maoism, but there's some truth to that in some of these places in the world that we're seeing mercenaries. And now that anybody who's rich enough can hire mercenaries to do almost anything they want, it's going to change who has power in international relations. And this is the stuff I saw when I was doing this work 20 years ago in Africa. And sad to say, it's just the trend line continues to go forward.
So you refer to a concept that kind of describes a lot of what we've been talking about, but I'd like you to flesh it out for us a bit more. You talk about this concept of Neo-Medievalism.
Yeah.
And how it threatens the world order, which has been dominated by nation states for the last few hundred years. Can you talk about Neo-Medievalism?
Sure. So Neo-Medievalism, I'm referring to when we think about the Middle Ages, most people call them the Dark Ages, which is a misnomer.
Right.
They weren't. When we think about the Middle Ages today, we think of like the Knights of Ni. We think about, Mad Max and the Thunderdome, stuff like that, right?
Right.
If we're on it. But that's not what the Middle Ages were. The Middle Ages, it's an era where it wasn't ruled by any type of category of political actors like a nation state, right? It was a free-for-all. And most of human history is a free-for-all. And you had states and non-states, and they were all on the same bottom. Nobody had a special authority. There's a couple of places like the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire was not a nation state. It was an empire. It was ruled by a city. A city ruled the Mediterranean. So when we think of nation states, we think of them as timeless and universal, but that's wrong. They grew out of after the 30 Years' War, and they had a beginning, middle, and they may have an end. And we're going back to a world that's no longer state-centric. And that's the point of the book. And a symptom of this is the rise or the return of mercenaries. Because remember, mercenaries they stand apart from the state system. In the state system, only national armies can have the monopoly of force, and everything else is outlawed. Now that we're seeing terrorists and insurgents and mercenaries and Russia using mercenaries and stuff like that, it really looks more like the world before the Westphalian, Treaty of Westphalia, before the Three Years' War, back in Machiavelli's day. And international politics is getting to a point where the global 0.001% will rule, the Fortune 500 will rule, groups like Al-Qaeda will rule, narco states will rule. I mean, it's not just nation states, it's everybody. And Washington, D.C. is not prepared for that. Our bureaucracy is only prepared to look at nation states, deal with nation states. And this is our challenge for the 21st century.
So, okay. That is fascinating. And, to quote you on kind of where things are going and what you've just kind of talked about, you say that the Westphalian order is dying, right?
Yes.
You say that the 21st century is maturing into a world mired in perpetual chaos,
right,
with no way to contain it. What has been tried so far has failed, making conflict the motif of our time, which leads to what you, Sean, refer to as durable disorder.
Yes.
Can you describe for the audience what is durable disorder?
So durable disorder is what's left in the wake of states as they retreat. As we call in international relations theory, the world of nation states, which is the world that we grew up, again, in sixth grade learning about, that's called the Westphalian order based on the treaties of Westphalia in 1648 and the world that's supposedly set up, which is that nation states rule, international law. It all comes back to then. That world is retreating. It's been retreating since at least 1990. And what's left in the wake of it as states, look at Syria, right?
Right.
Syria was once a strong government. Now it's a free-for-all. It's durable disorder for you, okay? But it doesn't, Syria is a kind of extreme example. Things don't collapse in complete anarchy. They do for a while in places like Syria or Somalia or Liberia or Burundi or the Congo, but they also kind of trudge along. There is governance on the ground often, but it's not to a flag or to a nation state. It's like to a tribe or to, there is governance on the ground in many places. It's messy, but it's not like the Knights of Ni. It's not like the sky is falling, let's invest in more sky. Most of us who are Westphalians think of if a world without nation state is a world of pure anarchy, like like The Road by but it's not, that's not the case. The world moves forward as it did in the Middle Ages and antiquity in durable disorder. We are returning to that. And the book, The New Rules of War, explains how to survive in that world, how to do well by it. Because if and we should also not mourn the passing of states too much, because let's not forget that when nation states were in charge, you had, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, some of the most brutal armed conflicts in history because of the organizing power of states. So it's not exactly a completely bad news story. The world's going back to the status quo ante of normal, in my opinion. The last 100, 200, 300 years of states being in control of everything is anomalous in world history. And we're going back to a much older type of governance, world order. And armed conflict, war, international relations will change as a result. Mercenaries are just a symptom of this. They're not a cause. They're just a symptom of this.
You paint a picture, especially in the New Rules of War, and you talk about in that book how to deal with this new world.
Right.
But after reading a lot of it, it's alarming, because although I'll tell you why it's alarming. Let me actually quote you here, and then I'll make my point. And this is kind of how I think we'll move towards finishing up with the episode. You say that we are dangerously unprepared because war has moved on. Yet the United States and other Western powers have not. They assume the future will look like the past and that traditional strategies will work in the decades to come. Should this foolishness continue, we will eventually be tested and we will fail. So before I make my comment on what's alarming, in my opinion, that's alarming, but I'll tell you what's even more alarming. Why is it that if we're tested and we don't change, why will we fail? We've got the strongest military in the world. I'm being devil's advocate here because I agree with you. But we've got the strongest military in the world. We've got the most sophisticated military technology in the world. Our Navy, our Air Force, our weapons are second to none. We have arguably the greatest special forces and special operations forces in the world. How is it that when we are eventually tested, that we are likely going to fail?
It's a great question. And this is the central question of my book, The New Rules of War. Yes. We have the best military in the world. Even our adversaries know it. But if we're honest with ourselves, Lawrence, we haven't won a war since 1945. Yep. So maybe all that high-tech military stuff is useless. I mean, because look, we're being beaten by Luddites, the North Vietnamese, the Taliban, the Iraqs. These are not superpower militaries. So maybe we got something fundamentally wrong about war. And that's the point of the book, is that there are many ways to win and there are many ways to lose. So let's look at right now in our country. We have a culture war going on in our country right now. Democrats, Republicans, blue state, red state, Fox, CNN, everybody knows this, right?
Yes.
Now, we know democracy is messy, but, and we've been here before. If we're having just a family feud, that's okay. That's part of what democracy requires, as ugly as that is.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case today. We have external powers like, Russia and China and others reaching in and finding the fissures in our society and ripping them apart and fanning those flames by taking issues like that are systemic in our society, like racism, and then just trying to amp it up, right? And causing divisions so that we implode from the inside out. That's a form of victory in war. It doesn't look like the Battle of Waterloo or Gettysburg, but it's the same type of, it's success nonetheless. There's other forms of winning as well. So when was the last time you saw a Hollywood movie with China as the villain?
It's been quite, I can't remember. It's quite a while.
Right. I mean, we have Russian villains, we have, terrorist villains. Why no Chinese villain? In fact, they're only good guys, like in The Martian, and they're only good guys.
Yeah.
The reason is because China bought Hollywood legally, like legacy studios and all. Next time you see a movie, look at the pre-credits, the studio credits. How many of those might be in Mandarin?
Yeah.
They get to greenlight movies that make them look good and kibosh movies that make them look bad. And they're building their own Hollywood in China to eclipse ours someday, they hope. And they're doing it. Like Wolf Warrior 2 was this Rambo-like movie that came out in 2017, over $800 million worldwide. I mean, that's like George Clooney money, right? So, and you're saying, okay, McFate, so who cares? They're in the movie business. Well, a form of victory is that all of our grandkids speak Mandarin as a second language and are sympathetic to Beijing values. And if you don't think that is useful, it's what we did to Germany after World War II. Look at West Germany in the 1980s. They were all speaking English as a second language. They're all sympathetic to liberal democratic values. Their ancestors in the 1930s and 20s would have been shocked to see that. So that is a way of warfare. Warfare is getting sneakier. Victory goes to the cunning now and not just the strong. We're purely invested in the strong. F-35s, Ford-class aircraft carriers, which cost $13 billion a ship. Before you add aircraft and sailors, that's nuts. That's like half of Brazil's defense budget. And they don't go to war. They're useless in modern wars. If you want to see what modern war looks like, go to Libya. Go to Ukraine, go to Syria. That's what war is going to look like. It's not going to be, we imagine the future of war is going to be World War II with better technology, right? But that's a farce. We have the Maginot Mentality. This is what the French thought, and they built the Maginot Line only to be outflanked in the Blitzkrieg. So that's why I think, our sophisticated military, our high-tech weapons, as amazing as they are designed to win major wars of the last century and not our century.
Absolutely stunning and alarming. And what's even more alarming is in reading the New Rules of War, you prescribe step by step the solution.
I do.
You prescribe the strategies that, and as I'm reading them, they make so much sense. You can clearly see why it will work. But what's alarming is that I honestly cannot see our government, our culture accepting what must be done in order to win in this new durable disorder, in this new world and these new wars. I can't see it. And this is great fodder for what I hope will be our second episode, because The New Rules of War is so fascinating. I want to do a whole, if you'll, if you'll humor me, I'd love to do another episode with you.
Yeah.
We can talk about the New Rules of War because you really do lay out. Now I know why our friend, the Admiral, called you a new Sun Tzu, because it is a powerful prescription for what seems like a quagmire, just an absolute mess of underhanded, sneaky maneuvering that is purely designed to render this country asunder. You just mentioned, a number of you also talk about lawfare in the book. There's just a number of situations that you lay out, which kind of portends our inevitable demise should we not follow the new rules of war. So I want to get you back on to discuss it if you're up for it.
Absolutely. Mercenaries is actually one of the rise of mercenaries and how they change warfare. And I think that's one of the critical pillars of it. But we have what I call victor's curse in this country. We assume, we'll get into this in the next episode, but the point of both books is not to just be alarming. They actually posit solutions as well. Yeah, the point of the book is to start a conversation and not end it. Because for a successful nation like ours to change its way of war usually requires a lot of blood, and sometimes not even then. And I'm trying to start a conversation so that we could bypass that. And there actually is an intellectual insurgency brewing in the defense community that sees it, which we can get into more in our next podcast. But both books are really about the war of the future, not the war of the recent past. And to people who are, really think of it, a traditional point of view, it might be shocking and alarming at first. But then I think once you think about it, hopefully it's something that gets some purchase, and that we're like, we need to rethink everything. And we can talk more about what that looks like. It's not as radical as it sounds. There's things that we can do that are simple.
Yeah, it's actually not.
Yeah.
But just knowing, entrenched thinking and how hard it is to kind of turn the behemoth.
Right.
It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
I can't see how any intelligent person.
Yeah.
Certainly in the military, but even, even the elites or within government, how you cannot read the rules of war and realize that, wow, we've got to rethink some things here and start inching our way towards adopting, this philosophy of the future of war.
It's getting widely read in the halls of the Pentagon.
Well, that's fantastic.
It's awesome. Some people love it, some people hate it, but that's not the point. The point of the book is to catalyze a conversation rather than to end one.
Some people are going to hate it because it budgets.
Oh, yeah, Lockheed Martin hates me.
No, yeah, that's for sure. But we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Jordan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Fascinating, compelling discussion. Where can our audience find out more about you and about your work, whether it's the nonfiction stuff that we're talking about, or even your new thriller, High Treason, and your novels? Where can people learn more about you and your work?
So you can check me out on my website. It's SeanMcFate.com. Links to all my books are there. The fiction is a mirror of the nonfiction. It's like a fictionalized version of it in many ways. You can also check me out on Twitter at Sean McFate. And I'm on Facebook occasionally. Okay. But and also you can email me. On my webpage, SeanMcFate.com, there's an email link. I do check that email every day, and I do make a point to respond to all email.
Fantastic. Sean, thank you so much for being on the podcast. As I said, an absolutely mind-blowing, super interesting conversation. Look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. That is a wrap.
Good. Is that okay?
I was great. Yeah. I mean, this, there's
So much to do. I know you're asking questions. I kind of went on a tangent high and right. So I hope that was okay. But
no, that was just, amazing. This is long form, so we can,
I like it. Yeah.
yeah, hold on. Let me stop the recording.